Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Ford Fischer is here today, and Ford has been covering the various protests and counter-protests that we've seen since May 2020. These include the Black Lives Matter and social justice protests, the pro and anti-police demonstrations, the pandemic-related things like the anti-lockdown and back-to-work demonstrations, the anti-fascist protests and counter-protests, and also the multitude of election-related protests during this period of time. Often these protests aren't easily categorized as left or right, or pro or anti-Trump or Biden or political party. And Ford not only describes the things that he's witnessed on the ground at these events, but also helps analyze what they're about and what's happening with a more informed and nuanced perspective based on his observations and interactions with the people on the ground. And in a bonus question, we talk about the recent warnings and predictions that a civil war is brewing. We recorded this on December 15th, 2020. Ford Fischer's here talking to us from DC. Hey Ford, thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's great to talk to you again.
Yep, thank you for having me.
So Ford if you haven't listened to our previous interviews, you might want to do that. You can hear about his work, but generally, Ford, tell everybody, who you are and what you do.
Right. So my name is Ford Fischer. I run a website called news2share.com. That's news, the number to share. But my work is largely on social media. I basically go to events where activism is taking place of any political flavor. So it could be right-wing activism, it could be left-wing, something else, something in between. And of course, a lot of situations that are actually two-sided. And I try to the best of my ability to live stream those events beginning to end and shoot raw footage of it, which I then distribute onto social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and the website, as well as making it accessible to documentaries, news programs, et cetera, for them to use in their program. So it's both sort of direct to my viewers as raw footage, but it's also accessible for other news media outlets to use. And I think that it's sort of complementary to the mainstream media in a way. Like, I think that it's a different take. It's a different way of doing it. It's an alternative media, but I think it also forces the mainstream media to be a little better because, they have to compete with somebody who is showing a situation in a very raw and complete way. Oftentimes I'm live streaming something for 4 hours that a mainstream media story might compress into 90 seconds, and it sort of forces them to keep it honest.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And if you're not familiar with Ford, if there's if there's ever any kind of, protest activity going on, go look for him because he's probably there and he's probably showing you exactly what's going on the ground. And you've done other important work too, like with court cases, Chelsea Manning and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, right. So for me, I guess when I say activism, I think the most obvious example is protests and direct civil unrest and so forth. But there are a lot of people who try to change the world in various ways. And so, yes, I have spent time, filming and interviewing, Chelsea Manning, for example, outside of her case when she ended up in contempt of court for not giving over information on Julian Assange, which I think was what brought me onto your podcast the last time, actually.
I think it was because, what impressed me was that you don't just get to see what's going on the ground from watching Ford's work, but you also see how little the mainstream media covers some things that he's there for, doing like the hard work of waiting. And, there's a lot of time off camera like that you generally don't even see. But that was one of the things that struck me about the Chelsea Manning case.
Yeah, I mean, and it's continuing to be, relevant right now as, a lot of Trump supporters, and of course, people outside of Trump supporters, to be clear, but a lot of Trump supporters right now are using this kind of final month and change with him in office to try to encourage him to pardon Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, and so some other folks. Reality winner, although I think that's probably less likely from the president right now. And so people have been pushing that. There was actually kind of a rumor online that he was going to pardon Assange, but it turned out to basically just be bad information. So that story's certainly ongoing.
Right, right. Yeah, there's those slices of common ground that I have with that movement. But anyway, so what we're going to do here is I'm going to ask you for a summary, like the evolution of the protests that started in May, the Black Lives Matter, the anti-Trump, the pro-Trump, and there are other issues mixed in with just like if we broadly say they're pro-Trump and anti-Trump, just, for simplicity, but we know that there's other things mixed in with that, important things.
For sure.
So if we could just talk about the summary of what you've seen, and then I want to zero in on what you've seen in the last couple of weeks and days.
Well, so I think that there were kind of two overlapping and not precisely related events, but they've really come parallel forward into the time period that we are now. And those two things were, from about March to May, there really was a drop off in the amount of, physical on the ground activism of any kind, because it was becoming less acceptable at that time to basically go outside, and do anything in person. But there started to be the reopen the economy protests kind of beginning around April and May. And I think that the thing that was interesting about those, or that some people might not have kind of assumed, is that they really weren't Trump supporting per se. They were certainly a right-wing and libertarian, for the most part, turnout, but they tended to really focus on state governments, because it was really state governments that were doing the shutdowns, right? They were local ordinances. If you go out in our city, if you go out in our state, if you're not wearing a mask, or you're outside for an unprescribed reason or whatever, right? And so I think that the anger was largely directed toward Democratic governors, such as Governor Whitmer in Wisconsin, and other blue states, or really kind of purple states with blue governors. Virginia's Governor Northam being another one.
Yeah, Murphy here too in New Jersey. Got some protests, yeah.
And so at the same time, of course, the George Floyd situation, also with Ahmaud Arbery having happened a little bit before it, and Breonna Taylor, which happened in March and really gained national attention because of the George Floyd killing. Those all kind of came into, bringing people back out onto the streets toward the end of May. And so for me, it was actually the last 3 days of May were when I went from, basically being in my house all the time to, basically constant protesting began in DC. It really kind of revved things up again. And I think that this created a strange political situation where there was a little bit of added spite from the right toward those groups, both because of the property destruction and so forth, but also because of wait a second, they're all outside and they're not catching the same, flack from the media, going on. And so that's a really common piece of rhetoric I've heard at pro-Trump demonstrations, at right-wing demonstrations, is people saying things like, they call us super spreader our events super spreader events, but the social justice protests don't get taken that way. So there's been this strange rivalry, even though they haven't really been direct protests and counter protests. It hasn't been my experience so far that there would be like a George Floyd protest and then people come out to counter it and say, well, no, George Floyd should have died. People aren't saying taking the exact opposite stance. It's almost more like there are these parallel groups of people protesting for their own causes and who basically oppose each other politically. I think that the thing that's really happened, though, in the last month, that's obviously drastically changed the course of all of this, was Joe Biden's victory in the presidential election. What's really weird about that is that or I should, maybe weird isn't the right word, but what's been really interesting, what's really changed the dynamic on the street since then is, whereas before you had people basically arguing or protesting over differences of what should be and whether things are good or bad, right? The police need to be defunded. No, the police should be funded. The economy should be open. No, it shouldn't be. There's a little bit of at least the same grounding in acceptance of basic facts, right? George Floyd was killed by the police. We have video of it. Nobody would contest that happened, whether or not they would contest what we should do about it. But with the presidential election and with Donald Trump telling people that indeed he won, even though basically every media outlet has called it differently, the states certified it differently, and as of yesterday, the Electoral College certified it differently. The Electoral College voted differently and is going to certify it, according to the way that the votes went. Now there's this disagreement over literally reality. People protesting for Trump are out there chanting, "Trump won, Trump won." That was what I saw on Saturday, even though, it seems at this point like there's not much hope for the kind of stop the steal movement. But I think it's interesting because that's going to continue. The inauguration of Joe Biden is not going to actually cause folks to change their minds about sort of reality as it is right now. So that's kind of the current state of at least the philosophy of the demonstrations that are going on.
Right. Now, going back a little bit to the big incident in Lafayette Square, were you there for that when the
You're referring to June 1st, the tear gassing of protesters to make way for Donald Trump to pose with the Bible in front of St. John's? Yeah, so actually on that particular night, I had been out the 3 nights before, and on the night before that incident happened, I had been shot in the head with a rubber bullet. And so I had basically like a half golf ball size sore out of my forehead. And I sort of made a risk calculation that said, on the off chance that I have a concussion or something, I just absolutely cannot afford to be out in the middle of this and then pass out. So I decided ultimately to watch that one from home and skip that evening myself.
Yeah. Well, that's understandable. Geez, I don't know if I remembered that you were injured. You generally wear a helmet too, but I guess it was really hot then too, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. So I actually, at the time, I was wearing a gas mask and goggles, but I wasn't wearing the helmet. And so the rubber bullet struck the top of the goggles, just barely strafing it, but it created this sort of 2-part injury on my face where the goggles were pushed down into my nose with like a partial, I guess, rubber bullet velocity. But then the rubber bullet still had basically a direct hit on my forehead. So
just like inches from your eyes, right?
Yeah, well, and thank God that I had the goggles on anyhow. Certainly if I wasn't wearing goggles and if it had gone into my eye, I 100% would have lost my eye.
Right.
And that happened to some people in Minneapolis. I had been out there in DC with someone who a week earlier actually did lose their eye in a rubber bullet shot from the police.
Yeah, there have been some serious injuries for years now, even from tear gas canisters too. People get injured pretty badly from those if they get struck with them.
Absolutely.
I did hear some firsthand things about the police horses charging the protesters and sort of the sudden scramble, and that certainly made things worse. But so the protests, the recent ones. Well, actually, let me kick back a little bit. So again, we already explained that this isn't cut and dry anti-Trump, pro-Trump, but in order to talk about it, you kind of have to generalize. So in the generally anti-Trump sets of protests, more recently, are they pro-Biden? Or how much pro-Biden activity do you see, and what are you hearing from people on the street about?
If I was judging entirely from street activism, I would say that nobody actually supports Biden. I think that really the focus on street activism has been, it's either been local issues pertaining to police and policing reform and so forth, which broadly probably has an anti-Trump stance, but isn't really about Trump. To the people who are actually anti-Trump still, their thing is not, we want Biden. I think that largely anti-fascists, Black Lives Matter, etc., they tend to see Biden as, at best, a tool to remove Trump from office, and in that sense, it appears that he's successful. But they are not really enthusiastic about him. So for Black Lives Matter, they have some of the same criticisms of Joe Biden actually that Donald Trump has, which are that he over his career that he basically has been a tough on crime political candidate. He's been hawkish on foreign policy to the extent that has come out on into activism, but really it's been the criminal justice stuff. I mean, and Joe Biden has not really postured to get the votes of those sorts of activists, either that he's taken them for granted or that he's trying to distance himself from the further left. But when Joe Biden was asked about defund the police, he not only did he say that he doesn't want to defund the police, he was saying we need to give the police more money, and that would go with reforms. And then he said, oh, and by the way, the one who really wants to defund the police is Trump, right? So his posture has actually been to say that comparatively Trump is actually the anti-police one, and that he is so pro-police that Trump is anti-police by comparison. Again, that doesn't mean that the Black Lives Matter supporters or that Antifa is precisely anti-Biden either. But I think that it is this important distinction, which is that honestly, the only time I've actually seen people be excited about Biden or really hold like Biden signs and stuff were the actual nights pertaining to Biden's election. So on election night, people in DC did hold up Biden signs and so forth. And when Biden finally reached 270 and the networks called it for Biden, similarly, there were people, celebrating on the streets and had Biden signs and stuff and were shooting fireworks. But even on that night, on the night that it was actually certified, right? The election was on a Tuesday and then certification on or reaching 270 officially on a Saturday. On that night, anti-fascist protesters in DC actually marched to the Biden people and protested against them. They said, they were basically saying, if you all are out here just for Biden and you haven't been out here protesting for Black lives, then basically they said, exact words, you're all a bunch of fools. So I think that it will probably come very much to the confusion of networks like Fox News that like to equate the far left with Joe Biden when Antifa protests continue. And I don't think anti-fascists are going to have any reason to stop because their issues fundamentally haven't been addressed other than we don't want Trump out here anymore.
Yeah, that's definitely the vibe that I've gotten. And I saw it heat up at times too, where I think the defund the police thing is the easiest thing to zero in on. Like there were some politicians who immediately jumped on that train, they jumped on that bandwagon. Yeah, let's defund the police and all that. But then it got really squishy for a while because, Biden as the candidate was definitely not on board with it, though maybe he didn't, I don't know how strongly he was, but after the election, he made it really clear that, yeah, we're not defunding the police. And, I never believed that any of the elite would go along with defunding the police. Anyway, that's who the police serve essentially anyway. So,
well, it's the enforcers of the state. I mean, so yeah. I mean, I think that it basically makes natural sense that that local political progressives, local activists who have face-to-face confrontation with police are going to be more inclined to have policy prescriptions that are against them, or that are for strong accountability against them. Whereas, when you're the politician, when you're the person basically in power, you're not going to defund the enforcement mechanism of your power.
Yeah, exactly. And protecting you,
Right. So, I mean, and to be clear, by the way, a lot of these protests have happened in democratic cities. So like Black Lives Matter here in DC is not fond of our mayor, Muriel Bowser, whatsoever. And it has generally been my experience that that's the same of most progressive movements, even in cities run by Democrats. I mean, another example would just be Portland. They're not fond of their mayor there, even though he does try pretty hard to garner their support, or at least say that he agrees with their principles.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Some of the mayors, and I think even one of the governors. I mean, they really did try to appease, but yeah, I guess the Black Lives Matter and the general, anti-police state protesters are, just not buying it. So
Right.
the Antifa movement,
Sure.
they are a little bit more. They tend to counter almost every pro-Trump protest and have for a really long time, right? So, and I think what you're saying is they've just been continuing the same work they've been doing all along, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I suspect that going into the new administration, Trump supporters will continue to do things. I think there will still be a MAGA faction on the street. And my guess is that Antifa will probably continue to focus more on them than the administration in power, even if they really oppose both sides. I think that a common justification for physical violence and for generally just anti-fascism as a street tactic in general is that in the 1930s in Britain, like there was the British Union of Fascists, right? There was I think I'm forgetting what the name was, Oswald Mosley or Mosley Oswald. Basically, there was a British fascist group, and when they marched, anti-fascists in the 1930s basically fought with them on the street, and that is somewhat believed to have prevented the rise of fascism in Britain as a political ideology. I think that even with Trump not in power, there will still be a considerable number of people who followed the Trump movement, which Antifa believes is outright fascist. And so therefore, I think that now you're going to have that fighting continue. It's just that it's civilian on civilian without the state really backing either side of it.
Yeah. And, they do have some common ground, which always makes it interesting, but that seems to be the two most at loggerheads, the two factions most at loggerheads, and maybe the most dangerous of all the different spectrum of people who are out there.
Right.
Yeah. So,
and I would say that I think part of the context of our conversation here is that this, the street fighting happened this weekend, talking now on Tuesday, but this happened on Saturday, that there was the March for Trump in DC. Proud Boys at the end of the evening basically were marching throughout the city looking for Antifa to fight. And they were saying it. They wouldn't disagree with my characterization of that. At least I don't think. They were literally marching around. Where are they? Where's the Antifa? We have to find them. Right? Like that was the actual vibe of what they were doing. And so, they're not doing it because they think that somehow a fight on the streets is going to keep President Trump in office. They're doing it because they want to fight. On the Antifa side, they see it as defending the community to fight back, regardless of who literally throws the first punch.
And yet both of them oppose the fascist nature of some of the lockdowns and all the pandemic related stuff. So that's interesting, but there's so much animosity between the two groups now that that's just under the rug somewhere. And so anyway, let's get into, because the MAGA movement, there's been in the media, there's been all kinds of op-eds and word gaming and planning, homeland security type things, and all kinds of concern, worry, and planning for the rise of the MAGA movement, and making the assumption that they're the ones who are going to be more violent. They're the ones who are going to be the real threat. And so far, from what I've seen, there's been not all bark and no bite, but like a lot of bark and not much bite to it. But I feel like I saw that change recently, just in the past couple of weeks. And I wonder if my impression of it, because, I try to go to your on the ground things and any on the ground things I can find and make up my own mind. But you have to invest a lot of hours to do that. You can't see everything. And basically you can't go the mainstream media is useless at this point. Yeah, I
Right.
just don't trust their narrative at all. So I like to hear from, somebody who's seen the whole thing, seen the progression or seen a lot of it. So is my worry justified? Has there
Sorry,
been a
could you
change?
repeat the original question?
Yeah, sure. So the from the beginning, there's been a ton of concern in terms of op-ed, in terms of
Right.
simulations and homeland security threat assessments and things like this. A concern that the MAGA movement was going to turn violent and that it could become a real problem. But until recently, to me, they seem to be mostly all bark and no bite. Not that dangerous a movement in terms of on the street violence, destruction, this kind of thing. But I think I have seen that turn in the
Well,
last
okay.
couple of weeks. And so
Right.
I wasn't
So
that concerned before, but I am now.
fair enough. So I think that it is a little bit hard to, I think, evaluate the threat level and to whom that threat is directed. I mean, I think it's pretty physically obvious that that violence on the streets has occurred in the last month, and that political factionalization certainly contributes to it. I think that there might be a change in format of some of the pro-Trump activism, but we'll see what it ends up looking like. When you enter a Biden administration, it's different when you are protesting on behalf of the state, right? Trump supporters protesting while Trump is the president are saying we support the state, right? So they're not taking an inherently aggressive posture. But that's different when you have a incoming president who they believe is not worthy of that position, who they think literally it was stolen. So when you have a faction of the citizenry who literally believes that the president is illegitimate, what could that possibly lead to? I'm not sure. I don't think it's really easy to evaluate that en masse. I think that's probably a question that you could you could pay a PhD sociologist to try to evaluate that, and I think they would still have a lot of trouble trying to predict. I will say that even on Saturday, one piece of rhetoric I heard from Alex Jones, who is becoming an increasingly reputable source among MAGA activists. Alex Jones twice on Saturday said to people, but to be clear, in person, I don't mean in the radio, I mean like on, at the event, in his speeches, was saying one way or another, Joe Biden is going to be removed from office. Like he later clarified that he didn't mean killing him, but the fact that he gave a speech where he later had to clarify that his speech didn't mean kill the president,
Yeah.
shows the level that the rhetoric has gotten to, I think.
Now, did you
So
see
again, who knows what types of actions individual people will take, though.
Yeah. Now, did you see the Flynn speech? I didn't
Uh,
listen to that yet.
Yeah, so the rally on Saturday was really spread out. There was 3 different rally points. So my understanding is Flynn actually gave 3 speeches. I caught on video a portion of one of them. But it was interesting to see. I think that people think of Mike Flynn perhaps as a lot quieter, than a lot of other ardent Trump loyalists, and not the case on Saturday. On Saturday, he was full-throatedly talking about how he believes that Trump won, how he believes that Republicans need to be loyal to the president by continuing to assert that he won and fighting for that in state legislators and so forth. So it seems like General Flynn really has attached his legacy to the president in a way that I don't think many people would have expected.
Yeah, there were, he was quiet for a long time for legal reasons. However, he had always had a group of supporters and his family and things like that. And they did talk about things like a digital army and things like that. So there was, even if it wasn't active, I think it was sort of always there. But yeah, it seems to be coming out into full force now. We'll see how much influence if he becomes like a leader of that the protest that emerges post Trump or not.
I'm not sure that he would be somebody who I'd call a leader in terms of activism, but I think he's definitely somebody that they look up to. I think he's among the most esteemed figures who has attached themselves to the stop the steal, ideology.
Yeah, and there are others who seem to be trying to take that role. People like Lynn Wood, which I don't know, who I don't know that much about, but I understand that he gave a big rallying speech as well. So we'll see how that develops. So anyway, I think we should probably roll. Well, let me just let you make any other comments before we roll into the bonus question.
Sure. Well, I guess I would just say, if you're interested to find this kind of work, just to give a kind of final plug before your bonus question, as you put it, my Twitter handle is @Ford Fischer. That's FORDFISCHER. The website is news2share.com, news the number 2 share.com, and it's news to share, just news the number 2 share, one word, on both YouTube and Facebook. So bonus question, go.
Yeah, you know what? There is one more thing I forgot before we do bonus question. What the stabbings? What did you actually see? What did you witness?
Right. So so to be clear, what you're talking about is on Saturday night, there was a stabbing incident in front of Harry's Bar in Washington, D.C. So I was actually about a half a block down. It was sort of halfway up a hill, like the road that they were on goes uphill a bit. So there was a big commotion that I could see, and I basically sprinted up to it, and I caught the end of it on video. I did not, with my own eyes, see the moment in which the knife, entered the people that it went to, But having reviewed footage afterwards, my understanding of what happened was basically that Proud Boys approached and began an argument and physically, punched a person who was on his own, and then responded by producing a knife and slashing and stabbing. Supposedly there were 4 total victims, although I saw 2 people being treated for injuries in addition to the person with the knife.
And the last I looked, they hadn't released names or, the extent of the injuries.
I haven't memorized names, but they did release the names. And so I believe it was only one person critically injured, but certainly nobody died. But the other thing of note is that the person who did the stabbing was initially charged with assault with a deadly weapon, but he was actually no-papered this morning, which means that upon showing up to court, it was discovered that the charges were dropped. However, that was not done with prejudice, meaning that there could be further investigation and they could recharge him. But at the moment, the person who stabbed the Proud Boys does not face criminal charges.
Who was it?
Again, the name is out there, but I don't have it in front of me.
What was it? Someone who was just in the bar, or someone who was there for the protests?
It happened outside. The individual was an African-American male who was wearing a black sweatshirt and basically appeared to just be walking. So he may have in some way argued with them, but he was on his own. That was what was surprising about it, and why everyone kind of ran to the commotion moments after it began, because it wasn't like he wasn't a part of a counter protest. So whether or not he was arguing with them or something before the events that were recorded by anybody, he certainly wasn't in a group or posturing for some kind of a street fight.
Interesting. All right. So the bonus question. So in the past, I've always asked you sort of what you've seen and filmed, what you've seen on the ground. But in our bonus question today, I'd like to ask you more for your thoughts, insights, and opinion on where you see these protest movements going. We sort of started to talk about this a little bit before. So for a long time now, people have been saying, there's a civil war and or a major crisis coming on the streets, and that it may develop into a real war of some sorts. I don't know. Mm-hmm. What war today is probably different than it was in the past. I certainly don't think it's going to be an 1800s civil war, but even maybe a breaking up of the country or the threat of that. Now, I used to disregard this a lot in the past because just what I experience in real life is just not people who are going to go out and fight. People have, Trump supporters and Trump haters live next door to each other and still, find a way to get along. And from my experience, or they just avoid the subject. So I used to disregard a lot of it, but I have seen a progression that's worrisome, and a buildup of anger and frustration. Um, and I am more worried about it now than I was before, and I'm just wondering what you overall think about that. The answer to the bonus question is in a bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to these bonus segments, one for almost every interview, by subscribing at Patreon. And plus you get access to other patrons-only benefits and a Discord channel. So that's my tease, and I hope some of you will join us. Now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. All right, Ford, well, I need to let you go. So let's roll back into the public part of this interview and make sure you tell everybody again where to find you, how to support your work.
Yep. So once again, my, I guess just cut it 1 second. Sorry. So my outlet is called News to Share. That's news, the number to share. You can find that on YouTube and Facebook, and then on Twitter, I am at Ford Fischer, FORDFISCHER, and the website is news2share.com.
And every time you are on the ground, you post links to the YouTube streams and Periscope streams on your Twitter account, right?
Yeah. So right now, I use an app that allows me to live stream to Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter simultaneously. So you can actually take your pick.
Okay, great. All right. Well, again, thank you so much. It's great talking to you. And as always, thank you for the work you're doing.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Ford Fischer. Follow Ford on Twitter at Ford Fischer. Follow his news site at N2S Reports on Twitter and at news2share.com on the web. Also support his work at Patreon. This podcast, independent media, so listener support is important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find the podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, or on Patreon or YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, please like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.